Imagine a crime, a really shocking one. The evidence is so strong, a conviction feels like a foregone conclusion. And then the legal system does something that nobody sees coming, something that really just rocks the foundations of justice itself. It acquits the accused.
But not for the usual reasons.
Right, not because of a lack of evidence or a technicality. The reason was, well, it was because the mind of the accused was, quite literally, fractured into 24 distinct pieces.
And that is the absolute core of our deep dive today. We are peeling back the layers on one of the most, truly one of the most controversial and landmark cases of the 20th century.
Yeah.
The case of William Stanley Milligan. You might know him as Billy Milligan.
It starts in 1977, Columbus, Ohio. The charges are incredibly severe: rape, robbery. And his case just forced the courts to look at a reality they were completely unequipped to handle.
Yeah, they really were. And so our mission for you today, as we guide you through all this source material, is to give you the essential shortcut to understanding this labyrinth. It's this incredible intersection of criminal law, of identity, and of a diagnosis that was, back then, often just ridiculed.
Multiple personality disorder. We know it today as Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DILI.
Exactly. And the central claim, the thing that makes this whole story so important historically, is that Billy Milligan became the very first person in U.S. history to be acquitted of major felonies, specifically because of this diagnosis.
These weren't minor crimes. These were violent, serious offenses. And the defense that they mounted, it challenged the very definition of who is accountable when the self isn't a single thing.
It really did.
And the detail that just makes this whole thing come alive, the thing that shows you the sheer scale of the challenge the courts were facing, is that number, 24. 24 distinct personalities.
And when we say distinct, we're not just talking about mood swings. We're talking about measurable physiological differences.
Like what?
You have personalities with different IQ scores, tested minutes apart. You have completely different skill sets. One of them could speak fluent Arabic. Another was an escape artist.
And maybe the most convincing piece of it all, they had different brainwave patterns. You could see it on an EEG.
That's it. It wasn't enough for the defense to just say he had these personalities. They had to prove it was real, that it wasn't just an act.
Mm-hmm.
And the evidence they brought forward was so compelling that it forced a permanent shift in how the law has to look at the brain.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack how this extraordinary story began, starting with the crimes themselves.
The crimes they're chilling.
So the year is 1977. The setting is the campus of Ohio State University. And a series of attacks has the community completely on edge.
Right. 3 women had been robbed and raped. And the facts surrounding the arrest of William Stanley Milligan, they weren't murky at all. From a police perspective, this was pretty straightforward.
They had strong evidence.
Overwhelming evidence, by all accounts. Milligan was identified through fingerprints that were left at one of the scenes. And then the victims also positively identified him from a lineup.
So to the investigators, this looks like an open and shut case. You've got a serial offender, you've got the evidence. Done.
It's a slam dunk.
Yeah.
But then, right after the arrest, things take this incredibly sharp, unexpected turn.
Milligan's defense.
His defense. He was consistent and he was baffling. He just claimed over and over that he had absolutely no memory of committing these crimes. He was adamant that he was innocent.
Now, in any typical criminal case, that's what you expect to hear, right? Deny, deny, deny. But there was something different here.
There was. The people who interviewed him said there was this emotional vacuum when he talked about it. It wasn't a performance. It felt like a genuine blank. And that's what prompted the legal system to say, okay, we need to get a psychiatric evaluation here.
So the initial assessment begins, and the psychologists, they aren't looking for some novel, headline-grabbing diagnosis. They're looking for the usual things.
Right. Psychosis, antisocial personality disorder, that sort of thing. Yeah. But very quickly, a few practitioners, most famously Dr. Cornelia Wilbur, they started to recognize patterns that were consistent with what was then called multiple personality disorder, or MPD.
And that diagnosis is really the pivot point of this whole story, isn't it?
It's everything. And you have to put yourself back in the late 1970s. MPD was viewed with, just intense skepticism.
He wasn't really mainstream.
Not at all. It was often dismissed as, a fad diagnosis, something that therapists were creating in their patients. So for the defense to decide to hang their entire case on this condition, it was an enormous risk.
A huge gamble. But what they found during these evaluations was, it was staggering.
The fragmentation they discovered in Billy Milligan was It was beyond anything that had really been documented in a legal context before.
Mm.
The assessments revealed not just 2 or 3 alters, but this fully operational internal system, a society,
Comprising 24 distinct personalities.
24, each with a name, a gender, an age, a specific role, a unique history. It was a whole internal world.
I just can't get my head around that number. 24 is. It's a committee. It's a small company.
It is. And this is where that core conflict gets established, the one that would go on to redefine American criminal law. How do you assign responsibility?
The physical body, Milligan's body was undeniably at the crime scenes. That's a fact.
But the core personality, the one known as Billy, he claimed he was completely absent, unaware, and therefore innocent.
And this is where we get into that critical legal separation. The prosecution has the actus reus.
The guilty act, the body did it, that's satisfied.
But the defense says the mens rea, the guilty mind, the criminal intent, was not present in the person on trial.
Exactly. If the core Billy wasn't even aware that he was committing a crime, could he really be held accountable for it? The defense used this analogy. Prosecuting Billy, they said, was like prosecuting the owner of a car that was stolen and used in a bank robbery by the thief.
That's a powerful analogy. And it really sets the stage perfectly for the legal revolution that came next. The court was forced to accept that before they could determine guilt, they first had to dive into this organizational chart of a human mind.
They had to map it out. They had to understand this inner world that, amazingly, operated with its own set of rules, its own hierarchy, its own government.
It forces you, the listener, to confront a really fundamental question. Where exactly does the self even live?
Exactly. And that mapping process, that detailing of who was who inside Billy Milligan's mind, that became the longest, most scrutinized, and most fascinating part of the entire trial.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's unpack this internal system. Because what the psychologist found wasn't just chaos inside his head, it was structured.
Highly structured. It was almost like a complex, self-regulating mechanism that was designed for one purpose: survival. Surviving profound, repetitive trauma from his childhood.
And the system of 24 alters was divided into 2 main categories, right? The 10 and the undesirables.
Correct. The 10 were the dominant personalities. They were the core group that the internal leaders allowed to come to the light, as they called it, to take control of the body.
And these were the ones considered, for the most part, non-problematic. They were essential for daily functioning.
Yes. For protection, for intellectual tasks, for just getting through the day. And at the top of this hierarchy was Arthur.
Arthur. He was the intellectual leader, the prime minister almost.
That's a great way to put it. He was highly educated, described as rational, very cultured. He had this deep well of knowledge about medicine and science. And here's the detail that just astonished everyone.
The language.
He spoke fluent Arabic, read and wrote it. A skill that the core personality, Billy, had absolutely no access to whatsoever. He'd never studied it.
So Arthur's function was essentially governance.
It was. He was the one who decided who got to control the body and when. And crucially, he wrote the internal laws that the whole system had to follow, including, and this is important, banishing the more dangerous alters.
So he was trying to keep the whole system safe.
From a very detached, logical perspective, yes, he was running the internal government.
And every government needs an enforcer, a head of security.
And that was Reagan Vadiskovich.
Raja, the protector.
The physical protector, yes.
Yeah.
He was described as being of Yugoslav origin. He was strong, he was an expert in karate, and he was highly controlled in his aggression. He was the one who handled dangerous situations.
And when you look at DID, this is a common pattern, isn't it? The emergence of these highly specialized roles.
It's a classic feature. Raging is the psychological manifestation of a necessary aggressive defense against the trauma they experienced. When the body felt threatened, Raging would front to ensure survival. He was the keeper of the hate.
Okay, so you have the intellectual and the physical protector. What about just dealing with the outside world?
For that, you had Alan. Alan was the manipulator, the smooth talker, the public relations guy. He was adept at getting the system out of trouble or just engaging in normal, everyday social situations.
And Alan had a really specific physical tell.
He did. This is one of those details that makes it so hard to believe it was all an act. Alan was the only one who smoked among all 24 personalities.
So when Alan was in control, Milligan's body would crave nicotine.
Exactly. And then Arthur or Raging would take over, and the craving would just vanish. Think about that. A physiological addiction tied to just one of 24 identities. It's mind-boggling.
It really is. So who else was in the 10?
Well, There was Tommy. Tommy was the technical specialist. He was a mechanical expert and, crucially, for someone who ended up being institutionalized, an escape artist.
He could pick locks.
Highly skilled at it. And at escaping restraints like handcuffs or straitjackets, again, you see a skill set developing out of a perceived need, that feeling of being trapped.
And then there's Danny, the artist.
Yep.
But he was also the fearful one.
Yes. Danny was very sensitive. He primarily drew these beautiful landscapes and still life scenes, but he carried this tremendous, very specific fear. He was profoundly afraid of men.
Which links directly back to the trauma.
Directly. It's a heartbreaking detail. It's connected to the horrific physical and sexual illness that Milligan suffered as a child at the hands of his stepfather. Danny represents that sensitive, artistic, highly traumatized part of the self that could only express itself through non-threatening art, and who was terrified of being hurt again.
That connection to the trauma is so key, isn't it? The system wasn't random. The fragmentation was a defense mechanism to wall off that unbearable pain.
Precisely. And that brings us to the personality who is absolutely central to the legal case and the acquittal, Adelana.
Adelana. She was described as shy, quiet, a lesbian. She wrote poetry.
Yes. And the defense argued that she was the one who craved intimacy, closeness, emotional connection with other women.
But the investigation and the conclusion of the defense was that it was Adelana who committed the rapes.
Yes. While Billy, the core personality, was completely dormant, unaware. And this distinction was the entire legal loophole.
Because her existence and her specific actions meant the defense could argue that the mens rea, the criminal intent, was compartmentalized in a separate entity.
An entity acting out of, these horribly misplaced emotional needs, totally distinct from the core identity's awareness. It was a brilliant, if controversial, legal maneuver to separate the perpetrator from the physical host.
Okay, so that's a look at some of the 10, the ones who were allowed to function. But what about the others, the undesirables?
Right. If the 10 were the working members of this internal society, the undesirables were the ones who had been exiled. This was a group of 14 personalities who were actively barred from controlling the body.
Barred by who? By Arthur.
By Arthur and Regan. They were deemed too dangerous, too problematic, or too self-destructive.
The fact that they had this group at all, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? It shows the internal system was trying to manage itself morally.
It's a huge point. They recognized that certain impulses were too destructive for the whole system to survive. For example, there was Kevin.
What was his problem?
Kevin had clear criminal tendencies. He planned small-time robberies. He was a bit of a thug. He was suppressed because Arthur knew that Kevin's actions would threaten the system's overall survival and freedom.
And then there's an even darker example in April.
April is a devastating example of internalized trauma and pure rage. She was vengeful, and her one all-consuming desire was to kill Milligan's abusive stepfather.
This wasn't just a bad mood. This was a fully formed personality with a homicidal goal.
A fully formed murderous impulse that was a direct reflection of the deep, righteous rage tied to that childhood abuse. By banishing April, Arthur was literally managing the system's own homicidal tendencies.
The complexity just keeps getting deeper. You mentioned other undesirables with unique traits.
Yeah, the fragmentation gets even more complex and specific. You had Sean, who was deaf. Completely deaf. He communicated only through gestures. Now think about that from a neurological perspective. How is it possible for one alter to be deaf while the others can hear perfectly fine? That detail alone profoundly challenged the neuroscientists who were studying the case.
It's like the brain can just switch off sensory input for one identity.
Seemingly, yes. Then you had someone like Mark, who was described as the zombie. He was passive, did very little, almost like a state of pure emotional numbness. Just a placeholder when no one else wanted to deal with things.
And there was one with a different nationality.
Walter, who was Australian. He loved hunting, he was an expert marksman, and he had a distinct accent. It shows how Milligan's mind absorbed and fragmented all these different pieces of identity, skills, even cultural influences he'd been exposed to.
So the system had to be incredibly complex to manage all of this.
It did. There was Martin, who was a conceited snob from New York. There was Lee, who was a prankster and a jokester who was always causing trouble, forcing Arthur to enforce the internal rules even more strictly.
The fact that the system had its own internal court, essentially, to suppress these destructive elements, that must have been a massive point for the defense.
It was huge. It demonstrated that Milligan's mind wasn't just chaotic. It was actively, if unconsciously, trying to achieve balance and control. It was trying to heal itself.
But there was one more personality, the crucial one, the unifier.
The teacher. the 24th personality. He emerged later in the therapeutic process, and he became the definitive witness for the whole story.
What was his function?
His function was unique. He was the point of integration. He was the one who had the combined memories and knowledge of all 23 other alters.
So he could remember what Arthur knew, what Adelana did, what Rajan felt?
Everything. He could see the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, he became the voice that could provide the unified, coherent narrative of Milligan's entire life and the history of the system. He was absolutely vital for Daniel Keyes to be able to write the book, The Minds of Billy Milligan.
So we go from a series of shocking crimes to this unbelievable internal society managed by a rational leader, protected by an enforcer, driven by a hidden artist, and ultimately documented by an internal historian.
It's an incredible structure.
Yeah.
And a structure that demanded objective proof, which brings us to the most scientifically contentious part of the whole case, the medical evidence.
Right. Because in a case like this, one that relies on such a, theatrical, hard-to-believe diagnosis, the defense knew they couldn't just rely on testimony.
No way. They needed cold, hard data. They needed objective, verifiable, physical proof that these personality shifts were genuine neurological events, not just conscious deception. And this is where the medical findings really became the watershed moment for the court.
Well, let's get specific. The evidence of cognitive and physical variability was...
It was overwhelming.
Right, it was. The psychologists gave a whole battery of tests to the different alters. One of the big ones was the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS test, an IQ test.
And the results were all over the place. Wildly fluctuating. I mean, the range was dramatic. It went from scores in the low 80s for some of the younger or more fearful alters, which would classify them as functionally impaired, all the way up to scores over 120 for Arthur, the intellectual.
How do you even explain a 40-point swing in measurable intelligence in the same person being tested just minutes apart?
You can't if you assume it's one person. The conclusion was that the different personalities had unique, fragmented access to the cognitive resources of the brain. The person claiming to be, say Danny, simply couldn't access Arthur's high-level processing power.
And it went beyond these abstract cognitive scores. It got into physical, measurable differences.
It did. The doctors meticulously documented distinct changes in handwriting depending on which alter was in control. The graphology analysis was presented as evidence in court.
So a tough personality like Rajan might have a heavy, angular script.
Exactly. While Adelana, the poet, would have this delicate looping style. This is motor control. The very way the hand holds the pen and forms letters was changing based on the identity that was present.
But the real bombshell, the evidence that really cut through all the skepticism, was the brainwave data.
The EEGs, the electroencephalography. This was, I think, the most compelling evidence they had. When doctors monitored Milligan's brain activity, the dominant neurological signature would fundamentally change as a different alter took control.
And this is so critical for you as the listener to understand. We're not talking about slight shifts here.
Not at all. Researchers, including Dr. Wilbur, they noted measurable changes in the frequency and amplitude of the electrical activity. For example, when Rajan, the protector, was present, the EEG might show high beta wave activity. That reflects intense focus, heightened arousal. The brain is on high alert.
But when a passive alter like Mark, the zombie, was present...
the brain activity would shift completely. It might move towards slower alpha or even theta rhythms, which are associated with calmness or a daydream-like state.
And that kind of activity, that's not something you can consciously fake, is it?
Not over a sustained period of observation. It's next to impossible. The brain was physically reorganizing its electrical activity based on which identity was in control, and that provided the undeniable, objective proof that the medical community needed to argue that Dady was real, and that Milligan was not just a superb actor trying to game the system.
We have to loop back to those distinct skills, too. Arthur's fluent Arabic is the most famous example.
I mean, speaking a language is a vast, complex cognitive task. For the host, Billy, to claim he didn't know a word of Arabic, yet for a switch to happen, and for Arthur to just flawlessly converse in it, it suggests a genuine walling off of entire language processing centers in the brain.
And Tommy's lockpicking skills?
Same thing. These weren't general mechanical abilities, they were specialized technical talents. If Milligan were consciously faking all of this, he would have had to learn and retain those skills himself, then pretend to forget them as the host, all while coordinating 23 other complex personas. The psychological load of a feat like that, it just makes the diagnosis more plausible than the idea of conscious deception.
So you have this huge collection of verifiable differences: cognitive, motor, neurological, and this just ignited an immediate and really a vicious public debate.
The world split right down the middle.
The supporters, led by the medical team, they saw the objective evidence, the EEGs, the IQ scores, as conclusive.
They argued that science proved the fragmentation was real, and therefore Milligan was a patient. He needed treatment, not a criminal who deserved punishment. They framed his condition as a neurological injury from trauma, which required a medical response, not a punitive one.
But the critics, they were fierce.
Oh, they were. Prosecutors, large parts of the media, the public, their skepticism really hinged on how convenient the whole defense was. They argued the personality shifts were too theatrical, too dramatic, and just perfectly designed to manipulate the legal system and get him out of prison time.
They just couldn't accept the idea of 24 minds in one body as anything other than a performance.
But the prosecution's problem was, how do you discredit the objective data? It's one thing to cross-examine a witness who claims to be Arthur. It's another thing entirely to cross-examine an EEG printout that shows a clear change in brain activity.
And that distinction right there, the difference between a magnificent performance and verifiable physical changes in neurobiology, that is the defining insight of this whole section. The court ultimately had to side with the measurable data, and that set the stage for one of the most radical legal arguments in modern history.
Okay, so let's shift to the legal battlefield itself. How did Milligan's lawyers actually pull this off? How do you acquit a man who was positively identified and fingerprinted for multiple violent felonies?
The defense strategy, while it was rooted in all this complex psychology we've been talking about, was actually brilliant in how it applied a very simple legal principle.
It all came down to mens rea.
The guilty mind. It's the absolute cornerstone of criminal law. To get a conviction for a serious crime like rape, the prosecution has to prove two things: the physical act, the actus reus, and the specific criminal intent, the mens rea, at the very moment the act was committed.
And the defense did something very clever. They conceded the actus reus. They said, yes, the physical body was there. The fingerprints are his. The witnesses are correct.
They didn't fight the physical evidence.
They couldn't. Instead, they argued that the necessary intent was absent in the individual who was actually on trial, William Stanley Milligan.
They argued that the specific intent, the guilty mind, was harbored only by the alternate personality, Adelana.
Exactly. They said Adelana possessed a fragmented, specific form of consciousness that drove her actions. And because Billy, the host, was entirely unaware of Adelana's existence or what she was doing, he was essentially asleep or dissociated during the crimes, he lacked the mens rea.
So if Billy didn't know right from wrong at the time of the offense because another entity was in control,
then the standard for the insanity defense, or at least a similar concept of lacking criminal responsibility, was met. It was a direct assault on the legal system's fundamental assumption that identity is singular and unified.
so Adelana's role was absolutely central to the whole thing.
It was everything. The defense presented her actions not as malicious criminal intent in the traditional sense, but as stemming from this trauma-driven, desperate, and horribly misguided need for human connection. By isolating the criminality to Adelana, they shielded Billy from responsibility.
And the verdict was historical.
Truly, Milligan was acquitted by reason of insanity. The consequence wasn't prison. It was commitment to a series of psychiatric hospitals for extensive treatment.
And that treatment was aimed at integration, right, at making the personalities whole.
That was the goal. But it's so important to stress, this was not freedom. He was institutionalized, but under a medical model. The court acknowledged that his condition was a disease that required intervention, not a moral failure that required punishment.
And that ruling set the precedent. He was the first American criminal legally freed from responsibility, specifically because of dissociative identity disorder.
The ripple effect from that decision was massive. The case didn't just end a trial. It ignited ethical and legal questions that are still being debated today all over the world.
It immediately raised the problem of identity injustice. If one body commits a crime but multiple minds exist inside it, how do you even apply the law? Who exactly are you holding accountable?
And what about things like rehabilitation or deterrence? If you imprison the body, are you punishing Billy? Or are you punishing Adelana, Reagan, or Arthur, who had nothing to do with the crime? The whole concept of specific deterrence just collapses if the individual is a shifting committee of consciousnesses.
The legal community was just forced to grapple with this. The law is designed to process discrete, singular actors, and now it had to somehow accommodate a fragmented consciousness.
It brought this unprecedented global attention to DD, and it fundamentally changed how legal systems had to acknowledge and account for complex mental illness in criminal cases. It mandated an evolution of legal frameworks.
It really remains a definitive milestone in forensic psychiatry.
It does. And the fact that he was sent to a hospital instead of a prison, that is so often overlooked, but it's the core of the verdict. It meant the court accepted the medical argument that these personalities needed to be integrated into a functional whole.
Integration was the goal. To teach the host personality, Billy, how to access the memories and the skills of the alters, and thereby create a unified, functional identity.
And the teacher, that 24th alter who was the unified memory bank, he played an immense role in facilitating that therapeutic process later on.
But the big question that hangs over all of this is, was he ever truly cured?
Well, after that landmark acquittal, Milligan spent years navigating the psychiatric hospital system in Ohio. The treatment, which focused on integrating those 24 personalities, it was long and arduous. He remained institutionalized for a very significant period.
And it wasn't a straight line, was it? The source materials detail periods of both progress and regression. It was a complex and often contested institutionalization.
Very much so. But he eventually did achieve a level of integration that was deemed sufficient for his release from official state supervision. And that happened in 1991.
And after that,
He lived out the rest of his life very privately. He tried to stay out of the spotlight, and he died of cancer in 2014 at the age of 59.
but his story has definitely not faded away. It really cemented its place in popular culture as the benchmark for psychological fragmentation.
Absolutely. Its legacy is preserved, most famously, in that 1981 nonfiction masterpiece by Daniel Keyes, The Minds of Billy Milligan. That's the book that brought this incredibly complex narrative to a worldwide audience.
And more recently, for a new generation, the story's complexity and its enduring mystery were explored in that really compelling Netflix documentary, Monsters Inside, The 24 Faces of Billy Milligan.
Which ensures that this case continues to challenge our contemporary perceptions of mental health and criminal justice.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just reiterate the key insights we've pulled from all these sources. We've seen that radical legal turning point, the successful men's redefense that changed everything.
We've explored the measurable physiological evidence, the fluctuating IQ scores, the distinct handwritings, and most importantly, those verifiable changes in brainwave patterns that ultimately convinced the jury that the dissociation was real.
And we learned about the crucial importance of that internal governance structure. The whole system managed by Arthur and Rajan and ultimately documented by the teacher. That 24th personality who became the vital source of integrated history. The one who allowed the fragmented mind to explain itself to the outside world.
This case forced society to confront the absolute limits of its own definitions. It remains one of the most provocative examples in modern legal and psychological history.
Which brings us to a final, profound question for you to think about. Given that objective, measurable physiological differences, like changes in neurological activity and compartmentalized access to skills, were so rigorously documented in Milligan's case, we have to ask, if criminal intent resides in the mind, and the mind can be demonstrably fragmented into multiple distinct entities, how does our fundamental definition of a single person or a unified consciousness even hold up when you apply it to accountability?
It's a huge question.
It suggests that the self might not be the singular, solid thing we assume it is. It might be a dynamic, sometimes fractured internal environment. And that's a realization that demands a continuous philosophical and legal reevaluation.
An intellectual challenge that ensures the case of Billy Milligan remains as relevant today as it was decades ago.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.